share this on our YouTube channel, which I'll give you the details at the end of my talk. So welcome to our second webinar. Oh, I have missed the first slide, so let me just go back. There we go. So this is our webinar series. Alpesh and I felt that it would be good to do some webinars while many of you are locked in at home with no embryology to do. So we asked our students on our certificate in clinical embryology what they would like to hear about. And one of the topics was laboratory aspects of ICSI with surgically retrieved sperm. So this is what Alpesh will be talking about today. So we recorded our first webinar last week, and that's on YouTube. I won't go through everything that I discussed then. In that introduction, I told you a little bit about myself and a bit about Alpesh, just to say that we've been working here for many years in this field. I started in embryology back in 1987. And Alpesh, what year did you start?
99.
Ah, so he's younger than me. And we've been doing hands-on workshops in various techniques for many years. I did the first embryo biopsy workshop. I think it was the first in the world, actually, when I was at the Hammersmith back in 1996, after visiting my friend Leander Wilton in Australia. She did a manipulation workshop, but it was a lot of animal embryology as well. But I think that was the first human embryo biopsy workshop. Excuse me, back in 1996. And Alpesh and I, a few years ago, set up our distance learning certificate in clinical embryology, excuse me. And we'll tell you more about that as we go through, and I will send everyone an email about the certificate. So just to say, it's a very flexible certificate. We have 8 modules. These are the 8 modules. You can take them in any order. You can just take one. You can take all 8. If you take all 8, you can use this to gain the certificate in clinical embryology. But the talk about ICSI today comes very much into module 1. Module 1 is our largest module by a long way. It's the real nuts and bolts that we felt embryologists needed to know. So we made this module 1, and it's from gamete to embryo. So we've got a wonderful talk by Kay Elder introducing us to the events that led to the birth of Louise Brown. Kay has worked for many decades at Bourne Hall. Then we've got Xavier talking about lab equipment. I talk about culture media. Kiri's talking about sequential and single step media. Steve's talking about semen assessment. Alpesh is talking about preparing sperm for art. And so this webinar is an extension of this. Then we've got Xavier talking about lab aspects of IVF, and Rachel Cutting, lab aspects of ICSI. Alpesh talks about the role of the embryologist in the egg collection. Mara about the pronuclear check. Catherine about blastocyst culture. Kay about embryo scoring. Alpesh about the embryo transfer procedure, and I introduced some of the new technology which we'll take further in module 6. Gloria talks about assisted hatching, and Walid and Christina about time-lapse. So with these talks, we have also given some videos to complement them, and this is our wonderful faculty just in pictures to see, really, as you can see, the world experts in these topics. So we have a logbook for the first 4 modules of our certificate, and some people ask me what a logbook is. So a logbook is a record of you doing a number of these procedures, which you then get signed off by a supervisor, ideally the lab supervisor or the medical director. So it's not a check of your competency, but it's a log that you have done a number of these procedures. We unfortunately can't on our certificate check your competency. We'd need to come and observe you do that, but we can check a log of how many of these procedures you have done. So in the lab logbook, it's very thorough. It's about equipment, media, semen preparation, oocyte preparation, insemination, fertilization check, and the embryo selection. So just to revise about how you can apply for the full certificate or for individual modules, you visit embryologycertificate.com. This will be the home page. You can click on either of these. Even if you want to do the full certificate, it's okay to apply module by module. And you've still got a few days left of a special offer in April. You can have one module for just £100. When you get to the checkout, you use the code 150 off, 150 off. And this, if you pay by PayPal, you can get access to the module immediately as soon as you register. So just for me to finish off, a bit about us and our social media. Next week's webinar is interpretation of PGT results. I will give a little bit of background about PGT. So will Alpesh, and then we're joined by Roy Naga, who is someone that worked with me at UCL for many, many years and now works for iGenomics. He's a very experienced scientist in performing PGT. And we know interpretation of the results is something that some embryologists really need some help with. It's not easy. And then on the 6th of May, IVF lab troubleshooting and culture media. And we hope that this corresponds with the launch of our module 4, which is all about quality assessment and troubleshooting. So all of you know that if you want to apply to come to any of these webinars, there's a different login each week. I will email all of you automatically who are on this webinar the details for next week, probably tomorrow. And I will put the video of today's webinar up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel. So our YouTube channel is the Embryology and PGD Academy. I'm really pleased that many more of you subscribed to that in the last week. So please continue to subscribe. We put a number of videos on there. On Facebook, we are the Embryology and PGD Academy. I have 2 Facebook groups. I prefer you to use the one called Joyce Harper Work that has this great photo of some of the key players in PGT. And Alpesh and I do quite a bit on social media. Alpesh's clinic are doing, I think this is right, Alpesh, you're doing live talks now on Instagram. And we're on Twitter as well and LinkedIn. So those are our Twitter handles and our Instagram handles. Alpesh, I think on Instagram you're Adoshi2. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. So if you want to know any more about the certificate, please visit embryologycertificate.com. If you want to know about the academy in a bit more detail, we've got a embryologyandpgdacademy.com website. And we would love to hear from you. I am going to do a poll at the end of this webinar to ask what you thought. If you'd like to give us any feedback, any future topics, or any comments, then please do. So that's a little bit about us. I am going to stop sharing my screen now. And great pleasure now. We've got well over 100 participants joined us. And Alpesh is now going to take over and tell us all about optimizing ICSI.
Oh.
Thank you, Alpesh.
Perfect. Can you see my screen, Joyce?
Yes, sorry, I just muted myself. Yes, that's great, Alpesh. Carry on.
Oh, perfect. So hello, everyone. My name is Alpesh Doshi. I'm a consultant.
Alpesh, sorry, I just realized we did have a few people that had raised their hands.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Oh, they've gone down. They've gone down again now. Okay. So just a reminder through Alpesh's talk, go to the Q&A button and add any questions there. Last week, we had 108 questions that Alpesh amazingly answered. So put any questions under Q&A and we'll come back to that when Alpesh has finished his talk. Thank you, Alpesh. Sorry.
No worries. So Alpesh Doshi, my name is Alpesh Doshi. I'm a consultant embryologist at IVF London. And today's talk is quite a basic talk, but again, it's something that many embryologists kind of struggle with in terms of the basics of micromanipulation. So my talk today is going to be optimizing ICSI, and I'm going to have a very special focus on surgically retrieved sperm, because this is where the challenges come in, especially when the sperm quality is very compromised. So we all know that over the years that the use of ICSI has really increased. And of course, beyond a certain point, our regulatory authority even stopped collecting data on the amount of ICSI that we do, because it's pretty much become run of the mill. In many countries, ICSI is the only method of insemination that is used. But even if you typically look at the rate of male factor infertility, that's kind of going up and up. And so is the use of ICSI over the years. Now, the indications for ICSI, we all know, are quite standard. In some cases, the thresholds are less than 10 million per mil of sperm. In cases where there is asthenospermia, teratospermia, or anti-sperm antibodies, specifically even for globospermia, where there is round-headed sperm. Now, in some cases, you could have ejaculatory disorders. You may want, your urologist may advise getting sperm from retrograde samples or electroejaculation samples. Can be congenital absence of the vas, failed vasectomy reversal, obstruction of the ejaculatory duct, and so on. So we know of the classic reasons why ICSI is done, and mainly attributed to male factor infertility. Or you could do ICSI in patients where you've had very poor fertilization by conventional IVF, and specifically for PGTM, whereby there's still a concern that the extra amount of sperm could lead to paternal contamination on the zona pellucida. But I know, I think I'd let Roy comment on this when he comes in next week, whether it is still mandatory to do ICSI for carrier mapping. So we're going to, again, as I said, this talk is more about the basics, and we'll start revisiting everything from the basic equipment that we use. We all know that we use micromanipulators, we use anti-vibration tables, platforms, and specifically micro tools to do the ICSI. In many labs, there's various different setups that people, that embryologists kind of use in their laboratory. Some people put the ICSI rig in a class 2 cabinet. Some put them in kind of these environmental chambers, which minimizes temperature and pH fluctuations. Some embryologists just keep it on ambient conditions, whereby there's only temperature being catered for. And specifically, some labs also have these kind of chambers built in around the whole micromanipulator. So then, talking about the micro tools, we all know that there's various micro tools available now in the market. You get spiked, non-spiked, different angulation, different internal diameter, external diameter. Most importantly, I think it'd be great to see whether there's any data around on what gives better fertilization rates. But I think the data is very mixed. And typically, what labs choose to use in terms of micro tools for ICSI is micropipettes with around 5 micron internal diameter. There is still a bit of a mixed choice around spiked and non-spiked. I personally prefer to use spiked pipettes, but most importantly, whatever pipette you use, make sure that it is MEA tested, it's got quality control measures in place. Whoever you're buying them from have got CE marking as well. In UK, we cannot use any products that are not CE marked as medical device. So again, this just tells you a bit about the quality standards that are used in manufacturing process at the other end. By all means, you should avoid making your own pipettes. This is something that was done like 15 years ago. It's no longer needed. Please avoid making your own pipettes because you will not have the quality control measures that these companies have in manufacturing them. So again, whatever you choose, whether it's equipment or consumables, you want to make sure that it's easy to use, it's reliable to use, and there's service available locally. We now move on to sperm preparation techniques, and then I'll kind of home into surgically retrieved sperm. But we all know, those of us who do embryology, that there are various methods of sperm preparation in the IVF laboratory or embryology laboratory. You can use the traditional swim-up method, or you can have density gradients. Again, many labs use different gradient densities. So I personally prefer using 45 and 90% of density gradients. Some labs use 40 and 80, and so on. With regards to PESA, surgically retrieved sperm from the epididymis, percutaneous epididymal sperm aspiration. This sperm has to be very gently treated. You've got to wash it, or if the sperm is very abundant, then you can do a mini density gradient. And I'll discuss a bit more a bit later. If it's testicular sperm, again, a very specific way of processing testicular tissue. You'd milk the tubules, you wash the samples, and it's very rare, but sometimes if the sperm is quite abundant, you would do a mini density gradient. But I generally don't like using mini density gradients when it comes to testicular sperm. We know that there are various products available out there to kind of digest the cells that is produced in testicular tissue, such as erythrocyte lysing buffer, collagenase enzymes, and we'll also talk a bit about pentoxifylline as part of my presentation. Of course, if you're using frozen sperm, you want to make sure that you kind of defrost it very near to the time of ICSI, because you don't want to defrost the sperm for a good few hours before ICSI, because the longer it sits in the incubation, the higher the chance of DNA fragmentation. So generally, I advise that if you're using frozen sperm or frozen testicular tissue, try and defrost the sample between 1 or 2 hours just before ICSI procedure. So when it comes to using PESA or percutaneous epididymal sperm, usually we know that these aspirates are collected by the urologist. And they're collected by inserting a small needle in the epididymis, and microliter aspirates are collected in sperm prep media. Now, the way we process this sample in the laboratory, I wash it one time in about 3 mils of Heapy's buffered sperm prep media, or sometimes, as I said, if the sperm is very good from PESA, I may do a mini density gradient just to get rid of all the non-motile sperm and the red blood cells, which are again quite prevalent when it comes to surgically retrieved sperm. Finally, after the wash, I resuspend the sample in about 100 microliters of fertilization media and keep it at 37 degrees and 6% CO2 till ICSI. Again, I don't want to keep the sperm for too long, but a maximum of 45 minutes to an hour. When it comes to testicular tissue, we want to make sure that however the testicular tissue is processed, whether it's a micro-TZ or an open biopsy where large chunks of testicular tissue are taken, you want to dissect them into 2 by 2 millimeter biopsies in the lab. And these are very tiny, so you want to make sure that you want to, you really want to kind of dissect the samples as small as possible. After you've dissected these biopsies into much smaller pieces, you would then use 2 insulin syringes with needles on to separate all the tubules individually under a dissecting microscope. At this point, I would avoid using a hot plate just because there could be evaporation of the media. So you want to make sure that everything that you do in terms of dissecting the tubules is done in plenty of sperm prep media. Okay. The tubules, once they have been separated, then you would individually hold each tubule with a needle and milk the contents of each tubule to remove the cells and sperm into the culture media. And again, those of you who use testicular sperm would exactly know what I mean by this. But literally, you hold one tubule on one side, and with a potentially a blunted pipette, glass pipette, you would just roll it around the testicular tissue and milk all the tubules. Once all the tubules are milked, you just remove all the kind of seminiferous tubules out and separate them out either by a sieve. There's some laboratory sieves that are sterile sieves that are available, and you can literally pass the sample through so that all the testicular tissue debris and everything is sieved off and doesn't contaminate the remaining of the sample, and the sperm are obviously allowed to pass through the sieve. Or alternatively, you can just literally separate all the gross amounts of tissue and just keep the supernatant there, centrifuge it at about 1200 RPM for 15 minutes, and then incubate till use. Usually we know that sperm selection is done at around 400. PVP is used to move the sperm, to slow down the sperm. We just use the traditionally normal looking spermatozoa under the 400 times magnification. I don't know many of you who use IMSI or much higher objectives to look at the sperm shape, but we all know that we give a lot of importance to sperm head and then ideally midpiece and then the tail. So all in all, we want to make sure that we have sperm with normal morphology to inject. We all know that immotile and poorly progressive sperm have got centrosomal damage and should not be chosen as a first course of selection. We should try and go for more normal looking sperm. When we are before doing the ICSI, or whilst we are hunting for sperm in the ICSI dish, again, this is done at 400 magnification. You've seen how I generally prepare my dishes. I just make very long channels of sperm prep media, and this is obviously Hebe's buffered media, and you do that under oil. I usually have a central drop of PVP, okay, and I would just release the sperm on one end of these channels, and if there is any motile sperm, they start kind of migrating through these channels. The whole idea is that if the sperm is abundant, you'd rather go in the middle rather than there, so you can get clean sperm that are swimming out from all the debris that you may have released at one end of the sample. So again, depending on the quality of the testicular tissue, it may be very variable as to how long it may take you to do the sperm hunt. But typically, this is how you do it. So we, yeah. Now, again, there's been some, presentations previously, and as I said, this is one of my quite an old presentation, so the data on there is also quite old. But again, some very reassuring work that has been done by many scientists that have seen the fertilization rate with the amount of time spent to hunt for sperm, especially testicular sperm. So if the sperm are quite easy to find, you do get a decent fertilization rate. But again, if the sperm takes a very long time to find, again, probably indicating non-obstructive azoospermia, then as you can see that the fertilization rate and the pregnancy rate also decreases. I want to now talk a bit about pentoxifylline, or if pentoxifylline is a phosphodiesterase inhibitor and increases CAMP levels in sperm. So what pentoxifylline does, or theophylline, the ready-made product is called theophylline. It's a chemical that can be used for surgically retrieved sperm where there is no motility seen. And within 10 minutes, if the sperm is viable, you'll start seeing motility in the sperm, which is subjected to pentoxifylline. Now, there have been several papers about the use of pentoxifylline or theophylline in the laboratory when it comes to the use of surgically retrieved sperm for ICSI. And again, all these papers have shown a benefit of using theophylline simply because it gives the embryologist a larger amount of choice when injecting sperm to perform ICSI, rather than just relying on any sperm that they see which is twitching. So we all know that when it comes to testicular sperm, we could sometimes be sitting there for a long time trying to identify which sperm is viable so we can select it for ICSI. But if you had a good choice of sperm that were moving around, then it makes not only the process much faster, but it gives the embryologist a potential selection of sperm to choose from for ICSI. And if you have 4 or 5 eggs and you've got about 10 sperm that have been moving, then you know that you will fine-tune your sperm selection rather than just injecting anything that you find. What we do with what we do at IVF London is we use the ready available product of theophylline, and again we just warm it up to 37 degrees. We dilute at 1:1 ratio in the ICSI dish itself. So what I mean by that is I make the channels, the sperm prep channels that I showed you in the previous slide, and I then replace those channels with theophylline media. Okay, again, everything at 37. And then I subject the sperm suspension into these channels. So eventually giving a 1:1 dilution of the sperm suspension and the theophylline. What we then do is literally as the sperm starts moving, you start isolating the motile sperm and putting it in the drop of PVP. It's very important to make sure that you wash the sperm very well in PVP before you inject it. Okay? We try not to exceed 10 minutes of exposure in pentoxifylline or theophylline, simply because we don't know what the long-term effects can be. Sorry. So again, it's important to make sure that, just as a matter of good practice, you do make multiple dishes if need be. If you've got 10, 15 eggs and you want to make multiple dishes for sperm hunting, so that you're not just using the same dish with the sperm overexposed to theophylline, and then you have no other way to minimize the exposure. So make multiple dishes to begin with. Make sure you have you minimize the exposure to 10 minutes. Here is a video of what sperm looks like when exposed to theophylline. So usually we all know that some of us who have dealt with non-obstructive azoospermic cases, you hardly see any moving sperm, or you might just see a twitching sperm. But when exposed to theophylline or pentoxifylline, you start seeing sperm that move quite well, and some of them also have a progression. So I know it's not a very good sperm there, what you see in terms of morphology, but I just wanted to give you an indication of how the sperm starts actively wriggling around or even progressing sometimes. Okay, so there we are, that you start seeing quite a bit of motility. Again, this kind of debris is very important, as you, it's very common, as you know, when using testicular sperm. So the idea is to try and minimize all this debris by make sure it's filtered off quite well. So some further considerations around, timing and whether to use HEPs or not, and whether to use exposure to PVP. I'm sure as part of the Q&A at the end, we will discuss this in a bit more detail, but I wouldn't want to kind of comment on whether you should use HEPs or just bicarbonate buffered culture media. Embryologists have their own preference. The most important thing to understand is that if you're using HEPs, then you have the comfort of taking your time in doing the procedure. If you're using culture media, bicarbonate buffered culture media, you barely have around 5 minutes per dish, which is outside, because after that it will start losing pH. The use of PVP or not is quite a variable choice as well. I have seen many embryologists who do not use any PVP to inject the eggs. There have been some very earlier studies that have shown a significantly higher fertilization rate when no PVP is used. But again, we all know that it's not easy to do ICSIs without PVP. So I think just generally out of choice and the comfort in doing the procedure and to reduce the damage rate as well, most embryologists around the world do use PVP to inject. And there's been some discussion about the type of swiping to be done, i.e. the immobilization. Again, there is no kind of advantage of multiple swipes or strikes. As long as the sperm is immotile, one gentle swipe is enough. And multiple swipes or strikes is not going to give you a higher fertilization rate. So polar body positioning is also something that gets highly debated in the literature. And again, I must just say that the data is very variable about this. I know as just good practice, embryologists keep the polar body at 6 o'clock or 12 o'clock position, but there have been papers out there that have suggested 3, 4, 8, 9 gives you better. Some papers have suggested 6, 7, or 12, or 11. So it's really variable data out there. Some images of the spindle have shown that the spindle is quite robust and will not be damaged as a result of the pipette going through. The spindle will just slide away when your pipette goes through. So again, it may explain the fact that however you position your polar body, it doesn't necessarily make that great amount of difference. But again, just to let you know that there is no consensus over where polar body positioning should be to get the best results, and various authors have shown very contradicting and different information. So how do we do our ICSIs at IVF London? So we typically do our egg collections at 36 hours. We put the gentleman in at around 37 hours. And of course, if it's surgically retrieved sperm, we would start defrosting the sperm at around 38 hours. I just wanted to add that for most of the surgically retrieved sperm, we don't do a side-by-side procedure. So we don't stimulate the woman and aim to do a fresh surgical sperm retrieval on the day. What we tend to do at our clinic, we always do the surgical sperm retrieval ahead of starting stimulation, so that we know that we have sperm rather than putting the woman through stimulation and then having no sperm. So we prefer to know whether we have sperm before we start any stimulation. So most of our ICSIs with surgically retrieved sperm are using frozen samples. So we would start defrosting the sample at around 38 hours. And of course, we're going to be talking a bit more about what is the ideal time to do ICSI, but in our clinic, we do the ICSI at around 40 to 41 hours. So we denude the eggs at around 40 hours. And again, if there's about 10 eggs or less, we would start the ICSI at around 41 hours, and ICSI should be completed by 42 hours. All this is hours post-trigger, hours post-HCG trigger. Okay, if you're using Glycerylin trigger, then of course that's the same thing, but you would use the same hours post-trigger rather than hours post-egg collection. And I think most labs around the world know that this is the measure that we use in the IVF lab rather than hours post-egg collection. So timing of ICSI, again, I think I saw someone put a comment up there that they've just submitted a abstract to say that the timing from their study didn't make any difference. I would love to hear a bit more about it in terms of what those timelines were. But typically, we are a bit strict in our lab about the timing for ICSI, and we would perform the ICSI between 40 and 41 hours. That is that is the play we have in the lab. We don't want to leave it for any time longer, because it could start affecting the polar bodies and fragmenting the polar bodies, which may indicate degradation of the DNA as well in the oocyte. So we're quite particular about the timing for the ICSI. Just to kind of wind up on a few slides, usually the egg collection is done at around 36 to 37 hours. We pre-incubate the eggs for about 2 to 4 hours to get cytoplasmic and nuclear maturation of the oocytes, and then we denude the eggs, as I said, at around 40 hours. The hyaluronidase or cumulase that we use is typically around 80 IU per mil. Again, it needs to be said that higher concentrations of hyaluronidase can induce parthenogenesis. So try and just work with the working solutions that you get rather than very concentrated solutions of hyaluronidase. So we know that it's quite important to make sure that the oocytes are also examined quite thoroughly, and typically the traceability is there from good quality oocytes or embryos deriving from good quality oocytes. So what we tend to do in our lab, we try and individually culture the oocytes in a time-lapse system, and we trace the oocytes literally from the time of ICSI to embryo development. That is the beauty of the time-lapse system, that you can culture individually now. But even if you are not using a time-lapse system, try and kind of separate your good quality oocytes from your poorer quality oocytes. And again, there are several grading systems that have been published on how oocytes, cytoplasm, maturity should be graded, how the polar body should be graded, etc. One thing I just wanted to say, it's quite important to make sure that the temperature on your micromanipulator is very well maintained, because we know that a drop in temperature can effectively depolymerize the spindle. And once the spindle is depolymerized over a certain amount of time, the damage can be non-reversible. So the depolymerization of the spindle can cause damage of the filaments, the actin filaments, and they can lead to non-disjunction in the chromosomes, leading to iatrogenic aneuploidy that has been induced or introduced in the laboratory. So it's very important to make sure that when you do your quality control, and of course we'll talk more about this in the QC talk that I'm going to do in a couple of weeks, and just show you the rigorous steps that we take to validate our equipment before we use it, including the micromanipulator. So just wanted to make sure that you all know that temperature is absolutely crucial when it comes to ICSI and micromanipulation. So again, there have been several, published papers on the importance of, temperature and micromanipulation. Just to give you an idea of how we do our measurements, you can see that we sometimes have to take temperatures as high as 40 degrees to get temperature of 37 or 37.5 in the dish. So we've got a thermocouple probe there that we measure the temperature with. And but I'm not saying that all of you should just use 40 and 41 degrees. Nowadays, you get very good plasticware that has got very minimal air gaps at the bottom of the dish. So this measurement and this validation has to be done in your own lab. Please do not take it as gospel that you need to set it at 40 or 41 degrees. In fact, with the use of new plasticware that we use in our lab, we have now reduced the temperature to about 38.5, just to get 37 in the dish. But this is just to kind of let you know that this is the level of quality control you should be doing. So the injection volume is also quite an important thing. So when you do your micro injections, try and minimize the amount of cytoplasm you aspirate as well, because you can damage organelles within the oocyte as well. So typically, I know it's very difficult to measure the amount of picoliters of cytoplasm, but generally we want to make sure that the cytoplasm doesn't gush into your pipette, and you have full control in the amount of aspiration you have during ICSI. So I'm not going to talk much about sperm DNA fragmentation and hyaluronic acid binding, because that's clearly some kind of mixed data out there about using PIXI and so on. At one point, PIXI was quite popular, but nowadays it's kind of phasing out, and so is IMSI. But there's new techniques that are coming in, such as Zymote sperm preparation chambers. And again, the whole idea of this is to select sperm or microfluidic chambers that allow the separation of sperm through these microfluidic chambers to pick out sperm with the best DNA and least fragmented DNA, so to speak. So the future is obviously trying to look at sperm, the ultra morphology of the sperm, and also use potentially polarized light to see what's happening inside. And I'm quite pleased to kind of see this, that this is kind of taking some reality. This is how the image looks under just the Hoffman's contrast. But again, with Nomarski, sometimes you can see, and using polarized light, you can see more detail in the sperm head as well. Of course, this is still in the R&D phase, but hopefully in the future, this may become a clinical reality, whereby not only are we seeing what sperm looks externally like, but we're also getting to see what sperm looks internally like. And finally, I just want to say that it's quite important to review practitioner data. And it's important to regularly review the KPIs, like fertilization rate, damage rate, cleavage rate, pregnancy rates, clinical pregnancy rates, and most importantly, implantation rate. The move is more going towards single embryo transfers now. So we want to make sure that our implantation rate is quite high, and we're just not in a practice whereby we're adding multiple embryos just to get a pregnancy. Thank you so much, and we can take some questions.
So brilliant, Alpesh. Thank you very much. That was so informative. Shall we just do the poll first? Yeah. So if you stop sharing your screen, we should.
Yeah.
We should be able to bring the poll up for the delegates. So we've got 2 questions here. Do you use, how do you say it?
Theophylline.
Theophylline. And how many hours post HCG do you do ICSI? So you should be able to start answering those. Yep, people have started. Now, the polls do not show on the video, so I will read out the answers once we're done. We're coming up to 30% answered. You're doing very well, everyone. So we're almost halfway. So if you want to keep answering. So Alpesh, at the moment, no is in the lead.
Okay.
And so how many hours did you say you do the ICSI after HCG, Alpesh?
Between 40 and 41.
Oh, yep, that's where most of our people are going to be. So we're at 70% have voted now. Does anyone else want to vote? So I think we're roughly there. It's so the answers are that the majority of people at the moment, 63% of people are not using yes. And for how many hours post HCG do you do ICSI? So at the moment, 17% have said 39 hours, 53% said 40 hours, 21% said 41 hours, and just 9% said 42 hours or more. Did you want to mention anything about that, Alpesh?
I think that's great to hear that most of the embryologists are sticking between 40 and 41%. Sorry, 40 and 41 hours post HCG. That is good practice. I definitely want to hear the comments from one of the delegates who's registered today, who said that she's submitted an abstract about various times of ICSI, and I think in her study she did not find any difference. Minky, her name was, or
yeah.
Sure. But
to come back on. So we've got 27 questions so far. So last week we had more come on as you were answering the questions. So please, everyone, feel free to continue to answer some questions. So wanted to ask, what I will do is I will read out the questions because again, they don't show on the video, and then Alpesh will answer them. So wanted to ask if we could get any certificate of attendance for the webinars. So for the free webinars, we are not doing certificates. It takes a lot of time to set this up, to email. I've literally emailed about 400 people in the last few days. And tonight I will load this webinar onto YouTube and then email everybody with the link. So we haven't, I'm afraid, got time to also do certificates of attendance. So sorry about that. But if you want some certificates, then please do some of our modules on our certificate in clinical embryology. You'll definitely get certificates for that. How many hours after ICSI should we perform the fertilization check? Good question.
After ICSI, we usually recommend, so if you have a time-lapse kit, if you have EmbryoScope, or if you have an EVA system, then you don't really need to be worried about when to do fertilization check. We know from time-lapse images that pronuclei can start appearing as early as 7 or 8 hours after the ICSI. But I have also seen through time-lapse imaging that pronuclei can start disappearing at about 18 hours as well. So generally, if you're not using any time lapse, I would say that the time for fertilization check is 16 to 18 hours post ICSI. But again, 18 hours could be a bit late, and you may start getting pronuclei breaking down.
Thank you, Alpesh. So Santosh, hi Santosh, has said, what is the importance of the light effect in IVF outcome?
That's a good question. There is not much research done about light. What we try and do in the IVF laboratory, we try and keep the lights very dim. One thing I want to add is that the lighting in the laboratory should be UV free, ultraviolet free. You should also prevent any natural light, any sunlight coming into the laboratory, because sunlight has UV elements. We know that the UV is mutagenic to the DNA of eggs and embryos. So we want to make sure that there is no natural light coming in, and whatever lighting system you have in the lab is UV free lighting. And again, keep it dim, because the uterus doesn't have glaring lights. So we want to try and keep things as physiological as possible. But there's some earlier studies done in the rabbit model that have shown that certain wavelengths of light can retard embryonic development.
Thank you. Do you inject immotile sperm? Do you use the HOS test?
So in my opinion, the HOS test is quite an antiquated test. And the disadvantage of the HOS test, there is a lot of false positives. So it's very difficult to accurately pick up viable sperm using the HOS test. So the HOS test has been kind of superseded by other tests such as the pentoxifylline stimulation test, and that's what we currently use. We use pentoxifylline or theophylline in our laboratory to make sure that we can identify viable sperm. Because motility is giving you clear indication of viability. You don't have to look at curled tails or anything, which you have to in HOS. So I don't think HOS is, in my opinion, a test for the modern day.
Sarah's asked, what do you think about the use of the calcium ionophore for round head sperms?
I strongly recommend it. I've had limited experience with globosospermia. So round-headed sperm are called globosospermic. And we know that round-headed sperm do not have an acrosome. And because they don't have acrosome, they will not essentially activate the egg to start the fertilization process. So I've had considerable success in using globosospermic sperm and getting fertilization, but by using calcium ionophore. So I'm not saying that calcium ionophore should be used as a blanket procedure for all ICSIs, but in our lab we use calcium ionophore, of course, after obtaining valid and vital consent, assessing which patients are going to benefit. But if the patients have got globosospermic samples or have had very poor fertilization in the past with ICSI. So if patients have got a less than 30% fertilization rate with conventional ICSI, then we will consider using calcium ionophore.
Sorry, I was just muted. How much incubation you give to oocytes once retrieved before denudation?
So as I said, I don't necessarily go by hours post egg collection. We should be going hours post HCG trigger. And that was essentially our discussion earlier on. So dissection should be happening, or denudation should be happening around 3 to 4 hours after egg collection. Okay, if it has to be egg collection. But as I said, it has to be after HCG trigger. So ICSI would be done typically at around 40 to 41 hours post HCG, which would, if a clinic is doing egg collections at 36 hours, then it would be 4 hours after egg collection.
What is the method to process TZ sperm?
I talked about it.
No, that's what I thought. Can I suggest to the person that's written that, if they want to watch the video again, I will send you the link. It will be on our Embryology and PGD Academy YouTube channel tonight. If you want to watch the video again, Alpesh has explained that, so he can go through that for you then. Next question, Imad, hi. If you don't find sperm, did you try to inject spermatids, and how to select the best one?
In the UK, we're not allowed to use spermatids. It's illegal to use spermatid injection, so we're not licensed to perform spermatid injection. I have some grave concerns about the use of spermatids, just based on the maturity of the sperm, etc. But the answer to the question is that we're not allowed to use them in the UK.
Thank you. Frozen oocyte with teaser sample. It had abnormal sperms, and the next day there was no fertilization seen. What will be the reason? That's $1 million question.
Absolutely. It could be anything to anything. I mean, it could obviously, if you got the oocytes surviving, then you're partially reassured that your egg freezing protocol and egg thawing protocol is working well. Of course, you've got to understand that the prognosis in such cases is very poor anyway. I don't know whether the sperm was obstructive azoospermia or whether it was non-obstructive azoospermia. But if it was non-obstructive azoospermia, then obviously the odds are much higher. Look, it's something which is perfectly possible, fertilization failure. If this couple were to ever come through again for another cycle, I would potentially do calcium ionophore.
Thank you. Did you inject big head sperm, or sperm with big heads?
No, I generally prefer not to. And again, one of the advantages of using theophylline is that it gives you a choice of moving sperm, depending on how many sperm there are. So, of course, if I had absolutely nothing else to inject after exhausting all my efforts at hunting for sperm, then I will just try using anything I have. But as a matter of choice, I would not inject sperm with large heads, because we know that these could be diploid as well.
Have you got a reference for the ELB and collagenase, which is CE marked and which you recommend, and the protocol?
There is no product which is CE marked, ELB or collagenase. A company called Gynemed is making it, Gynemed, Gynemed, but it is CE marked as an in vitro diagnostic product. It is not CE marked as a medical device. But personally, I don't use any ELB or collagenase. I just prefer to minimize the use of those enzymes in the IVF laboratory. Not that I have any data to prove my dislike towards them, but I've managed so far. It's just quite important to make sure that you try and minimize the amount of red blood cells. And when you see my presentation back, I showed you the way I make my dishes, which has got channels of media. So the sperm tend to move away from all the debris and the red blood cells. So I don't generally find having all those cells in tissue a big problem, because the sperm tend to move out and migrate because I use theophylline.
The optimal centrifugation force and time for each sample?
Good question. Generally, I try not to exceed 1500 revolutions per minute, especially in very fragile sperm or testicular sperm. Generally, I use around 1200 RPM for all processing in the laboratory, whether that is semen or whether that is testicular sperm. I do not exceed more than 1500. And the time, maximum 15 minutes.
Thank you. Is pentoxifylline CE marked, and is it okay to use by the HFEA? Well, as you said, it's not CE marked, but is it?
It is not CE marked as a medical device. It is CE marked as an in vitro diagnostic product.
And the HFEA are okay about us using it?
Because there is no comparative CE marked medical device product available. If there was, then you are obliged to use that. But if there is no other product which is CE marked as a medical device available, then you can use it. Same with calcium ionophore. It's only a CE IVD.
Thank you. When are we confident to say there is no sperm in the sample? After 3 hours, or should we finish the whole sample search?
Very good question. As much as it's very brain numbing to sit under a microscope for hours and hours looking for sperm, trust me, I have seen sperm after 3 hours of hunting as well. My hat of responsibility tells me to tell you till you have seen the entire sample.
Hard work for the embryologist. I feel that pentoxifylline induced motility much better and faster than, I can't say that, theophylline. Do you agree, Alpesh?
My opinion would be purely retrospective, because when theophylline was not available from a commercial supplier, I used to make my own pentoxifylline. And but I have not compared them side by side. But because now we can only use a product which is CE marked, whether it's IVD, my preference would be to tell you guys not to make your own pentoxifylline and to buy the ready available product. So because now theophylline is available as a commercial suspension, I would recommend you to use that. But of course, if you've seen differences, this is interesting, but I don't have data of comparison. Essentially, they do the same thing.
Can you inject oocytes with spermatids from teaser sample? Well, as you said earlier, we're not allowed in the UK, but what do you think?
Yeah, the answer is that we're not allowed to. I personally have no experience even how to identify spermatids. So it's just, you know, over the 20 years I've worked in the field, we've never done any spermatid injection. So I would not even know how to identify them.
Is there any predictive tests that can be done to predict the sperm retrieval percentage after microteasy, especially in difficult cases like, I think that's Klinefelter's, like MGG staining to ejaculated cells? Did you have any experience with that? And what is the percentage if so?
So generally, all patients where we have azoospermia on ejaculate, we would send them to the urologist. And the urologist would potentially then look at the endocrinology of the male, look at if there's any varicocele, or look at the FSH of the man, trying to understand whether it's an obstructive or non-obstructive case. The answer to your question is that I'm not aware of a process whereby you can predict the percentage of sperm seen. So my only predictor I would go by is the FSH value of the man. And if the FSH value is low, this potentially indicates that there is active spermatogenesis going on. If the FSH value is very high, i.e. over 25, it may suggest that there's primary testicular failure or totally non-spatial spermatogenesis in the testicle. So this is where the urologist has a big input. And as lab embryologists, we would simply be there to process the tissue that we get.
We've got a few questions about pentoxifylline. Suha said, years ago we used to buy it from Sigma, but it's not allowed anymore. Using available tablets from the pharmacy, the tablet is coated with starch and sugar. Can we still use it, and how? Or where else could we buy pure pentoxifylline?
So I would go with theophylline. Don't try and make your own. Yes, Sigma used to make pentoxifylline powder many years ago. But me and you both know that when you start making these things in the laboratory, the quality control is not there. So I would suggest that the product is available to buy commercially. It's very cheap. It's about 53 euros a vial. So you don't really need to worry about the cost element of it. And the shelf life is pretty good as well. So Gynemed is the company, Gynemed. It's in Germany, and they've got a website as well. So the product is called Sperm Mobile, SPERMMOBIL, Sperm Mobile. And those of you who are interested in finding out about the calcium ionophore, the product is called Cult Active, CULTACTIVE, Cult Active. These are the commercial names of the product.
Another one about pentoxifylline. What volume would you use with 1 microliter of semen sample?
So we don't use semen meat. You cannot use semen meat to extract sperm for ICSI. So you either do a swim up first, or you do a density gradient centrifugation first, isolate the sperm out of the seminal plasma, because seminal plasma can be toxic. So you want to get the sperm out of the seminal plasma by using either one of the laboratory-based methods, either density gradient centrifugation or swim up. And then whatever suspension you get, you would dilute it 1:1. So if you have 1 microliter of sperm suspension, you would add 1 microliter of theophylline, 1:1 dilution.
How long does it take to do an ICSI?
Very variable. It depends on various factors. It depends on the skill of the embryologist. It depends on how bad the sperm is in terms of the surgically retrieved sperm. I have done an ICSI in 10 minutes, and I have done an ICSI in 3 hours. So it really depends.
We always say, how long's a piece of string? What is the maximum amount of tissue you suggest the surgeon take in difficult cases? Is there a limit?
So rather than, I would advise that, or at least the concept here in the UK now is a micro TZ rather than just a TZ. So if we know that if it's an obstructive azoospermia case, then just going on one side of the testicle with one biopsy is fine. And if you ask me what is the size of that, I mean, I don't know, 4 by 4 or 5 by 5 millimeter biopsies, okay? But usually, if it's micro TZ, i.e. non-obstructive, and the urologist is taking biopsies from about 9 or 10 different areas of the testicle, then the biopsies have to be small. So again, I would say 3 to 4 or 5 by 5 millimeter biopsies maximum.
Did you have any experience using the spindle viewer?
No, we had spindle view many, many years ago in our laboratory where I used to work before, but we didn't have any extensive experience. We had just loaned it and we did 1 or 2 research projects, but that was it. But we had no correlation because we were so, we were very rigid in our temperature maintenance of the micromanipulators. We hardly saw eggs without spindles illuminated. And again, as I was showing my previous slides, spindle depolymerization is purely based, or it mainly happens if your lab temperature or your heated stages are erratic.
If not using TLT, do you advise a group culture? If so, how many in 50 micro?
Good question. Yes, if not using time lapse, then I prefer using group culture. I still am a slight believer in autocrine and paracrine effects that the eggs may give each other. However, proponents of autocrine and paracrine factors say that if you were to get an impact of the autocrine and paracrine factors, then your volume of culture has to be very small, typically 10 microliters or 15 microliters. But if you're using 50 microliter drops, then one can argue that is there any impact of the autocrine and paracrine factors that you're getting. But I prefer, whenever I don't have time lapse, I would prefer to group culture, and I would use a maximum of 5 to 7 eggs together.
Sorry. How do you perform ICSI when oocytes with 60% SER?
Of course, there's quite a bit of evidence out there that SCR eggs should not be chosen as embryos to transfer. So the answer to that question is that we would still inject these eggs, but we would keep them separate and monitor their development. But as a first round of choice, I would not prefer to choose an embryo that has derived from an SCR egg.
Is there any cutoff value for teaser sperm count you get in your lab?
No, I mean, you know, they can't be. You're trying to look for a few, not even a few hundreds. So they can't be a cutoff. You know, if you, in our lab, we have also started working on single sperm vitrification now. So it's not just the slow freezing or the vapor freezing. We have also trying to optimize single sperm vitrification, and that's also working quite well.
Can you give more details on the use of light refraction in sperm selection?
Well, I think the impact of light or the use of light in terms of sperm imagery, there's quite a bit of evidence out there in terms of trying to catch the sperm under a certain refractive index. I don't tend to use this routinely. I sometimes just minimize the amount of light angulation from the micromanipulator just to see the sperm head a bit better. But it's nothing in comparison to using ICSI magnification or, IMSI magnification or things like that. So we've used a lot of IMSI in the past, But again, the data has been very scarce about the use of IMSI and the benefit. So that's why I didn't even choose to talk about it, to be honest. But there's very limited information about the use of light. If you're referring to my last slide, whereby we were trying to look at polarized light and sperm selection, I think this is very futuristic. And I visited a lab in Russia that was still doing quite a bit of R&D work on sperm SEM, scanning electron microscopy, and of course you have to fix the sperm, but some beautiful images that came out of that, and those images were given, that I had on my slide, were given to me by the team there.
What do you prefer? What do you prefer, concentration of PVP, 7 or 10%?
I use the ready available one. I don't dilute it further, so I use the product from Cooper Surgical. I think it could be 7%. I'm not 100%, but I use the ready prep. So again, I don't tend to tamper with any product that has been made in another commercial environment, because then you start becoming manufacturers of that product. And the HFEA and the European tissue directives insist that we don't become manufacturers. You have to use the products how they're supposed to use.
Do you do ICSI right after denudation? I can't speak.
After an hour. I tend to leave my eggs for about an hour, at least 40 minutes after denudation, because it gives the eggs a chance to recover. Because don't forget, the ICSI in itself is a traumatic procedure on the membrane of the egg. So I tend, and denudation is also a trauma on the egg membranes. So I let the membranes relax, restabilize again, and then do the ICSI after 45 minutes to an hour. Not straight away.
What do you use to milk the TZ sample? How about HIV positive patients where syringes are not an option?
We don't process any HIV positive or any virally positive patients in our laboratory.
How to minimize oocyte degradation, considering embryologist has sufficient proficiency and microtool setup is perfect?
I don't get that question, sorry.
How can you minimize oocyte degeneration? So if considering the embryologist has sufficient proficiency and microtool setup is perfect, I mean, I would have said that's impossible. If your embryologist is proficient, microtools are perfect, some eggs are just going to degenerate. They're just not of good enough quality.
Generally, as a benchmark or KPI in the lab, I expect the degeneration rate to be less than 5%. If the degeneration rate increases to 7%, then you've got to start really looking into it. That is it the stimulation that you're getting? Are you getting more fragile eggs that are just coming? You know, the embryologist has something to do with it, but not everything to do with it. Sometimes a lot of embryologists on the forum will tell you that the moment you stick a needle in, the cytoplasm just comes gushing out. This just means that the quality of the eggs are quite inferior. So yeah, you'd start looking at the stimulation, you'd start looking at the progesterone level in the patient, whether she had a premature surge of progesterone. I would start looking at the sharpness of the pipettes, because just by looking at a microtool, you don't know if it's sharp enough or not. So again, I would try and immediately get another batch of microtools to see if that makes a difference. I once had this problem, and I moved from a 5 micron internal diameter pipette to a 4.5 micron internal diameter pipette and a much sharper spike, and we got rid of that problem.
Do you freeze TZ samples after an ICSI cycle? If yes, do you freeze supernatant or whole sample or separately? One for supernatant, one for surgical.
I always prefer to freeze testicular tissue rather than supernatant sperm, because the survival rate of sperm in the seminiferous tubules is better than actually sperm retrieved out of the seminiferous tubules. So the answer is that I prefer to freeze testicular tissue, but of course, if all the sample has been milked and you want to preserve some sperm, then you have no option but to freeze the supernatant.
Sorry. So someone's asked to explain the method of dish preparation again, but That's on, we've got a lot of questions, we've got 100 questions, so we're halfway. So that's on your video, Alpesh. So can I suggest that they look back? Yeah?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, please look back. The video will be on YouTube later tonight. Someone said, I haven't come across any differences in fertilization rate between 40 and 42 hours, but they feel that there's low embryos with injection at 42 and after 42.
Okay.
What is the method of pentoxifylline to make sperm motile?
So literally subject the 1-to-1 dilution of pentoxifylline and some sperm suspension and start hunting straight away. The sperm should be reactive to pentoxifylline straight away within a minute or two.
So someone's asked how to take a practical session. So I assume they meant for training, but on module 1 for the Academy, we have got some videos of doing sperm prep. I think we did do some videos. So yeah, we did do a video of that. So otherwise it's just learning from each other, really. Did you have any other comments?
No, I mean, it's something very difficult to demonstrate, especially surgical sperm retrieval and how to prepare the tissue. What we will do is when I have the next case in my lab, I will record a whole preparation of how we prepare testicular tissue, and we can upload it onto the Embryology and PGD website or YouTube channel.
Thank you. Do you ever inject with immotile TZ sperm?
If I have absolutely no sperm that are moving, and I've searched and searched and searched, and after consulting the patients, because sometimes they may prefer to just use donor sperm, because we all know that the prognosis with non-motile sperm is very poor. I must add, very poor. So I think that's a discussion that needs to be had with the couple. If they prefer to use donor sperm, then you've got to give them that option first, because otherwise the prognosis is very poor. We know that we can get fertilization from non-motile sperm. If the patients do not want to choose or use donor sperm, I also sometimes give them an option of egg freezing. Let's just freeze the eggs.
Okay, Alpesh, we're at we've got about 20 minutes left, and we've got about halfway. So I'm going to whiz through. Someone was confused about the way to prepare the sperm dish, but I think they just need to go back and look again at the video. Maybe have some dishes in front of them. What is the case of elastic ooplasm? I think.
Ulema. I mean, when you say elastic, ulema should be elastic. It should really refill back. So having the ulema, which is a bit elastic, it's normal. I think if you mean the ooplasm being sticky, I think you probably mean sticky cytoplasm. This is not a good sign, because that just is going to lead to degeneration of the oocytes.
How far into the egg do you recommend inserting the injection pipette and where to deposit the sperm?
I usually, and again, I don't think that there must be some studies, but I haven't come across one. But I usually go 3/4 into the egg and then start aspirating. So 3/4 of the diameter of the oocyte, and I keep my tip of the pipette 3/4 in and then aspirate and release the sperm there.
Do you inject the M2 eggs if mature the next day?
No.
For TZ sperm, you prioritize morphology or motility, e.g. better looking twitching sperm versus bad looking sperm moving fast?
No, I would prioritize morphology over movement, because TZ sperm have very variable degrees of movement. So morphology, definitely morphology over motility when it comes to TZ sperm.
Instead of theophylline, could we use a laser shot at the tail of immotile testicular sperm?
I have no experience on this. I have heard of papers or read papers that have used laser to check for viability of the sperm. I would still feel that it's a bit like the horse test. I'm not sure what the reproducibility and accuracy of this test is. Personally, I prefer to see blunt motility in the sperm, and that's why theophylline is a much preferred option for me.
Do you think we should do 2 FERT checks? Is there any advantage? If you're using a time lapse, you won't need to do two, but
correct. I don't think you need to. I generally, what I do with, even if I'm not using time lapse, if there is any 0 PMs, I would keep them till day 2. And if they do develop, then potentially, you know, that something could have happened in terms of fertilization. So I never discard any of my unferts till day 2, once we've checked if they're divided or not.
how much time do you suggest to leave the denuded oocytes until injection? So I think you already said that one. I saw a video of ICSI after injection and pulled the pipette, then gave a slight pressure on the oocyte. Will it do good in fertilization rate? Because it's the first time I'm seeing such a technique.
I don't quite get that. Usually when we introduce the pipette, to break the membrane, we do apply a bit of pressure on the ulema anyway, and then release the sperm. So I'm not quite getting the concept there. I don't know if you mean something like the piezo drill or something like that, but that's a whole new concept altogether.
Okay, we'll carry on. Can we just directly do a mini gradient for PESA sample and skip washing step?
Yes, you can. You can do a mini gradient, and you can definitely, but you still need to do the wash after the gradient. You can't use the sperm straight from silica colloidal particles, which is in the density gradient. So you need to still wash the sperm after the density gradient step. Only if you have a lot of sperm. I repeat, only if you have a lot of sperm. Otherwise, you lose all sperm that may be there if it's very small numbers.
How do you handle or perform milk the tubules or surgical testicular by insulin needles? Is there any alternative besides an insulin needle?
Good question. Yes, there is. So there's some products in the market. There's a company called Hunter Scientific that makes mortars and sterile mortars and pestles for testicular tissue tubule milking. I find that as a gross procedure, this is fine. It gives you an indication straight away if there is any sperm or not. But if I am using, and if of course, if there is plenty of sperm there, then you're okay to use. But it's literally a small Eppendorf tube. It's got a little more, a pestle in there. You put the tissue with a couple of drops of media and you just mortar and pestle it, and you take the supernatant and you can use it straight. I prefer not to use that generally.
Do you suggest, sorry, do you suggest to search the TC samples first, for example, find for probably 10 sperms, immobilize them, and then only proceed doing ICSI? Would this affect the outcome?
Good question again. I wouldn't change my protocol of milking or anything like that. But I think the question is, would you select a few sperm, inject the eggs, then go and select more sperm? Yes, I do that. Because I try and minimize the amount of time that the sperm are in theophylline to 10 minutes. What I do is I select as many sperm as I can in 10 minutes. And then I go to the eggs, I inject those eggs, put them in culture, and then go back, hunt more sperm in theophylline in a fresh dish, and then go and inject more eggs.
What should I do in the case of zero motility, even after the use of theophylline and HOS?
If the patient has something called Cartagena syndrome, you will not get motility despite using sperm stimulators like theophylline. And in such cases, you may just have to do a injection with non-motile sperm, because there's something called Cartagena syndrome whereby you may not get any motility in the sperm because there is a damage to the mitochondria.
Could you please share me your tips when you have to do ICSI with fragile or non-flexible oocytes, how to reduce degenerative rate?
Just have to be very gentle in terms of the injection. You know, sometimes, especially frozen eggs, when you use frozen eggs, the ulema is very weak. So you have to really alter your technique of injection, especially when you try and aspirate the cytoplasm. But try and release the sperm very gently. Try and break the membrane very gently, just so you can try and minimize any trauma as a result of your pipette going in and out. Other than that, you really can't do anything. Some people have suggested using the piezo drill, which I just talked about, that the degeneration rate using the piezo drill is very low. But I don't have any experience. I know of a couple of embryologists who use it and swear by it, but it's a very expensive piece of kit.
Is it okay to incubate teaser biopsy overnight? Any role to incubate the tissue?
I have known people doing it. I don't do it. I just am more concerned about the infection risk with that the moment you allow things to brew in an incubation environment. Testicular sperm, you can have pathogens there that will just rapidly develop or multiply. So I don't do it. I just literally do it hours before. I have known of labs that do this. They actually thaw the tissue the night before, keep it in culture, and then use it the following day. I have my reservations about the outcomes.
So Ahmed gave us some comments that he did a study to compare ICSI as regards the time lapse between the sperm prep and ICSI, and he's noticed that the best results in terms of fertilization and pregnancy rates was obtained for samples left between 3 to 5 hours, and the least results were after the very short incubation, less than an hour post-prep, or longer than 7 hours.
So I think it can be a bit questioned, because there's correlation between how long you leave the sample at 37 degrees 4 and DNA fragmentation. There's more and more papers suggesting that now we should not leave our samples for too long at 37. If his study was leaving the samples at room temperature, then maybe yes, I agree. But I think leaving leaving the sample for 7 hours in the incubator temperature, potentially there could be more DNA fragmentation in the sperm.
Well, we did a study years ago, and we found that keeping the sperm at 37 for a long time was not good. I know it would seem more physiological, but I don't think we ever reported that actually. Do you report low concentration sample, e.g. TZ, in HPF? Yeah, if yes, how do you count and report HPF?
HPF.
Do you report low
concentration? Yes. Sorry. So when I look at TZ samples, I report the samples as number of sperm seen per high power field. Correct.
Should the light in the IVF lab be kept on 24 hours?
No.
No. In setup of manipulation temperature, what do you prefer to put in, 37 or more? No, as we've just said, not. No.
But for sperm, you mean?
Yeah. In the setup of manipulation temperature.
Oh, so they mean the ICSI rig. So again, as I said, you need to validate this temperature in your own lab. You need to take the plasticware that you use. You need to use thermocouple probes. You need to set up an ICSI dish how you do under oil. Take temperature. It all depends on your ambient temperature. The temperature in your drops is dependent on several factors. So I can't tell you that use 39 on your heated stage, use 40 on your heated stage. I've worked in labs whereby I've had to raise the temperature to 40 degrees and 41 degrees. And I'm currently in a much more physiological lab environment whereby there's consistency in the lab temperatures, etc. And we don't exceed 38, 38.5. So it is a test that you have seen one of the slides where I literally set up a thermocouple probe and you test it yourself and then move forward from there.
In the scenario, we have collected several teaser TZ samples, but all the samples are immobile sperm. What is your recommendation for the next step?
Theophylline.
Okay, good. Does calcium ionophore work in total failed fertilization?
I think so. So if you've had total failed fertilization with ICSI before, then calcium ionophore is the next thing to try. If you've had fertilization failure with conventional IVF, then you just go towards ICSI.
Would you still use a sperm that used to be mobile during its selection but becomes non-mobile once you put it in the PVP, even before immobilization?
Generally, I only look for more. Oh, you mean if you mean testicular sperm? Yes. If the sperm was moving in theophylline, chances are that when you move it into PVP, it will stop moving. That doesn't mean it's not viable. So yes, the answer to your question is that I would first look at sperm in theophylline. It's moving. I pick it up. I put it in PVP. I immobilize it. I wash it around in PVP to remove the pentoxifylline or theophylline, and then inject it straight into the egg.
Can you briefly share your calcium ionophore protocol?
It's very straightforward. So after doing the ICSI, you have to put the eggs for 15 minutes in a drop of calcium ionophore at 37 degrees and 6% CO2. So you have to pre-equilibrate the dish of calcium ionophore. Again, these protocols should be given to you by the company that actually you buy the calcium ionophore from. 15 minutes at 37 and 6% carbon dioxide, and then removing them out of calcium ionophore, washing them thoroughly in fertilization media before they go into your overnight culture.
What is the principle of the Qualis technique and uses?
What technique?
Qualis. I don't know what that is.
Oh,
Oh, okay, so a few comments from Ahmed. He did a study to compare ICSI as regards the time lapse. Oh, we've had that one. Oh, that one came up twice. Okay. Do you think, yeah, we had that one. Do you think 1-to-1 pentoxifylline is too much? The old recommendations for pentoxifylline was 1 in 20.
No, with theophylline it's 1-to-1. So I've always, I mean, it all depends on what your what your stock solution is. So in the days when we were making in the days that we were making pentoxifylline in the lab, our concentrated solution was 10 milligrams per mil. And then our working solution was 1 milligram per mil, so 1 in 10 dilution. Okay, and then our working solution was 1-to-1 dilution. Do you get that? So you start off with your stock solution is 10 milligrams per mil. On the day of ICSI, you prepare a solution which is 1-to-10 dilution, and then you further do a dilution 1-to-1. So your theophylline, I believe, is literally 1 milligram per mil.
Okay. In the COVID situation, and you're going to restart your ICSI patients, do you have any recommendations to disinfect the lab?
I think we're just still learning a lot about this, to be honest. Just a thorough deep clean about the whole system. You really need to do the complete clean out that you would do at your Christmas closure, for example. So everything will have to be deep cleaned, sanitized. I recommend, I mean, one thing I'm going to do potentially in my lab is there's something called a hydrogen peroxide bomb that you get companies that will come and just release hydrogen peroxide, which eventually breaks down into oxygen and water. So it's non-toxic per se, but you leave all your equipment and everything open, let them come and release this bomb. Overnight, you have to keep the whole lab shut, and then you're good to go the following day. But just thorough cleaning, I mean, of course, make sure that the solutions that you're using to clean are virucidal and they're active against COVID.
Does denudation cause degeneration of the oocyte? Well, no, otherwise we wouldn't do it. Okay. Do you suggest to perform host and teaser sample before processing?
Do you suggest to do host and
hypoosmotic swelling test?
I don't do hypoosmotic swelling.
Did you prepare calcium ionophore in the lab or ready to use brand, and which brand?
Called Active from Gynemed.
Okay. What is your suggestion of either real-time sperm selection versus selection of all sperm beforehand? Some agree that certain factors will cut flow of immobilized sperm, and which further reducing its fertilization capacity.
I agree that sperm should not be immobilized way too ahead of time, because the moment you immobilize sperm, there could be some factors that are being released from the mid-piece, or where you're kind of kinking the tail, which could be activating the oocyte in leading to fertilization. So I don't like just picking all my sperm at once and then injecting at the end. I have certainly seen a much lower fertilization rate in doing that. So I tend to just pick a few sperm and minimize the amount of time after immobilization.
Okay, we're going to whiz through the next few. Is there a major difference in the results of ICSI between a sealed inverted microscope and an unsealed one?
No, I have used both, to be honest. I don't use a sealed microscope now. I just do a conventional microscope, micromanipulator on an anti-vibration table, and the results are good enough. I use a Heapes buffered medium, but certainly if you do not use Heapes buffered medium and you're using culture medium, then you want to use a potentially sealed environment which has got CO2 being blown in to maintain your pH. The most important thing is that you do your checks to make sure that your drops are maintained at physiological temperature.
Did you do ICSI immediately after denudation? So I think you said that, but yeah.
No.
What is the reason of a pinhead sperm and how to treat it?
We don't know what the reason is, to be honest. It's just faulty spermatogenesis. Depends on, I've sometimes seen pinheads even are there in ejaculated samples. Not to say that it has no other sperm. So you just ignore the pinheads and you go with the normal morphology. I do sometimes see that surgically retrieved sperm have more pinheads, but I think that's just an observation. I don't think there's any scientific basis in that.
Right, we'll try and whiz through these last few, Alpesh. What is the best time of oocyte what is the best type of oocyte activation media?
So I only use the calcium ionophore. That's the only media I've had experience with.
From the slide temperature and the spindle, what is the time limit before the cause of depolymerize the spindles when fluctuation temperature occurs?
So what you're saying essentially is what is very variable. I think the earliest studies that Paula Almeida did, I think she said that if the temperature exposure was more than 20 minutes at suboptimal temperature, then you could potentially see a non-reversible impact of repolymerization of the spindle. So generally, I think in the IVF lab, we are trained to perform a technique whereby the ICSI dish doesn't stay out for more than 5 to 7 minutes. So that temperature is, if there is a temperature fluctuation, you can put it back into culture and the spindle can repolymerize.
What is the highest cutoff time for ICSI that can be taken in consideration with surgical retrievals?
It's a good question. I would always, with surgically retrieved sperm, I would always try and inject the eggs at 40 hours, not 41. So whenever I have surgically retrieved sperm, I start my ICSI at 40 hours, not 41. So it still gives me 2 hours to finish the injection.
Do you prefer to perform TZ for cryptozoospermia or use ejaculated semen?
For cryptozoospermia, it's a difficult one, because if someone has got ejaculated sperm and does have some levels of normal sperm in them, how do you justify them doing a testicular biopsy? So as a matter of rule, if there is sperm in the ejaculate, we always go by that, because we wouldn't have justification in telling them, well, you need to have a surgical procedure done because your ejaculated sperm is poor.
So a couple of messages from my dear friend Maria. What about using laser pulse to hit sperm tail? So you did mention that one earlier.
Yeah, I personally don't have much experience with that. Yes, people have been using laser to inactivate sperm rather than the swipe, the swipe technique, which we use with ICSI pipettes. And it works. I don't know what level of damage that does, but then we don't know what level of damage the swipe does. So I would love to see some evidence or some data on that.
Sometimes after TZ ICSI and no PN appearance on day 1, there might be embryos appearing late day 2 or day 3 at the correct cell number. How do you explain it? Would you transfer? We do, but with no positive results.
I think it really depends on whether these eggs have been culturing in time lapse or not, because we know that with TZ samples, sometimes pronuclear formation can be quite erratic. Now, if you have been in time lapse and you haven't seen pronuclei full stop, then usually the prognosis of these embryos making it to the blastocyst is very, very poor. But if you're in a conventional incubation system, then yeah, you may have missed the pronuclei.
Okay, right, Alpesh, we'll try and whiz through. We're on to more questions than last week, actually. It's great to have this wonderful discussion, but poor Alpesh, I feel like we're giving him an exam here. It's like a PhD viva. So we'll whiz through the last ones, Alpesh, because time's getting on. Have you experienced certain brand or certain batch of ICSI pipettes that give higher degeneration rate?
Yes, I have.
Okay.
So you have to change it.
Yeah. Okay. In normospermia, you conventional IVF or ICSI, your experience, please. Oh, do you prefer conventional IVF or ICSI? I know what Alpesh prefers.
IVF all the way.
IVF all the way. That's a big recommendation in the UK. You mentioned to do SSR before start of stimulation. You will freeze the sample, presumably. How do you ensure the survival of sperm is enough for the upcoming ICSI? Because there is also a scary experience.
You can always do a test thaw. So if you've got a good amount of testicular tissue there, pre-freezing, take a small piece and freeze it and do a test thaw to find out what the level of survival is, if that's the layer of reassurance you want.
What is the range value of FSH in man? I met one client had 0.13 and our lab range value was from 0 to 82. Can I report the FSH is low?
I think it's all the units of measurement. In the
Yeah.
UK, units of measurement are different. In UK, we say if the FSH is over 20, then potentially the man has got primary testicular failure or non-obstructive azoospermia. So yes, I think up to 10 is normal in men, but it depends on the units of measurement.
So retrograde ejaculation, we are going on RE or go to TZ or another option?
If there is sperm in retrograde, then of course that's a whole new different subject. But there is a very strict protocol for retrograde ejaculation, and you first have to give the patient some alkaline buffering tablets of sodium bicarbonate for a couple of days before they do the sample, because you want to neutralize the acidity in the urine. So that's how you would essentially treat it. But if the man can ejaculate, albeit it's retrograde, I would still try and give them that comfort first of trying to do it naturally rather than putting him under the knife. But yes, there is a protocol on how to treat men with retrograde ejaculation.
Have you picked up sperm that had a normal head but bended tail after being frozen? Is this normal?
I mean, you look for others. Yeah, you can find all kinds of abnormalities pre and post, especially in testicular sperm. But hopefully you have other sperm. So you literally, the way you look at sperm, you put them side by side next to each other and try and select the best based on this choice you have. At that point, we may not have the luxury in choosing the perfect sperm, but you just have to see what is bad and what's worse.
If there's a delay in the pickup, for example, 38 hours post HCG, would you do it ICSI at 41 hours?
Always stick to the time of the HCG, not on the time of egg collection. So yes, even if you do a 38-hour egg pickup, your denudation hour would still be 40 hours and your ICSI would still be 41 hours.
Okay, Alpesh, I think we should whiz through these next year. There's still a few questions left. Pentoxifylline is a CMARC product. It's an IV medicine used for ischemic patients. It's just have a different commercial name. But anyway, theophylline is available now and is much warmer. So someone else asked about the certificate for the webinar. Not for free webinars, I'm afraid. It would just take up a huge amount of our time. If I take a long time in selection, can I retain to incubator for 20 minutes and then start again?
I don't get that question. What's the question again?
If I take a long time in selection, can I retain back to incubator to 20 minutes then start again? Don't worry. We've got lots of questions. Do you advise multiple ICSI dishes for larger number of oocytes? If so, how many would you suggest?
Maximum, especially if you're doing surgically sperm retrieved ICSI, you don't want to exceed more than 4 eggs per dish, 4 or 5 eggs per dish.
Do you cryopreserve immobile sperm retrieved by TZ, or do you prefer a vitality test?
I always use theophylline. Even if I find motile sperm at the beginning, I still use theophylline to get better selection of sperm.
Any comments on oocytes with severe PV debris for ICSI or freezing?
Poor prognosis of such oocytes, but pregnancies have been found. So again, don't rule them out as a rule of thumb. You always still inject them, separate them after injection so you can track their development, and don't choose that as an embryo if you have others.
So we've got several comments and questions here about sperm vitrification and about what kit you use, and can we have a webinar? Another one about more details about sperm vitrification, another one about freezing micro TZ samples. So maybe just in one sentence, Alpesh.
I can't discuss sperm vitrification. It is a bit of a confidential product which I'm developing with industry.
Okay, so everyone watch this space. Alpesh is working on it, and hopefully we'll have a protocol very soon. How will you inject oocytes with SER? Any implications that you know of if we punctured the SER during ICSI?
It all depends where the SER is located. Yes, the idea is always to avoid the SER. It also depends on the size of the SER. If the SER is central and quite large, you can't avoid it. You'd have to puncture it. But try and avoid puncturing the SER. At that point, I would pay more emphasis on missing the SER rather than worrying about where the polar body is.
A pole scope, is it worth investing? Deferred biopsy test and cryo or fresh biopsy to make ICSI in the same day?
So we don't do a fresh biopsy. We always do a deferred TZ.
So a question here about fragile eggs, but I think you've really covered that over the other few questions. According to ASRM or TZ cryopreservation, do you agree that a maximum of 5 samples will be frozen?
It all depends on how, when you say 5 samples, what, you know, 5 ejaculate, if it's 5 ejaculated, yes. If someone's doing ejaculated samples, yes. If it's a cancer patient, I tell them to do 5 ejaculate freezes. But you can't make someone do 5 testicular biopsies. If the question is how many vials would you create out of a testicular biopsy, then I would say yes, 5 or more.
Any differences if we incubate denuded or ICSI dishes 1 hour before ICSI, or incubate right after the egg collection before using the dishes?
No, I always prepare my dishes at least a couple of hours before the micromanipulation procedure, just to get them to right temperature.
If we had a failed fertilization, next cycle, would you recommend calcium ionophore combined with delayed ICSI 43 hours post-trigger?
No, I would just do calcium ionophore at the normal time, which is 41 hours.
Any advice on ICSI when encounter oocyte with large PV space?
No, there's nothing you can do. If these are frozen eggs and if you have a large PV space, then you may have to question that you may not have rehydrated your eggs properly during the thawing process. But if it's just fresh eggs but have a large PV space, then just check the pressure in your egg collection pump. If it's a very high pressure, then you can have dysmorphism of the zona pellucida as a result of the suction, and can get large PV space. But you have to inject what you have.
What do you think about mechanical ICSI?
Mechanical ICSI meaning piezo drill? I haven't used it.
We'll move on. We've got the last few now, and I think Alpesh is getting tired. I'm getting tired. As per Kruger, more than 4% normal sperms are considered normal. Do you agree that it's not good to release more than 15% sperms as normal?
Personally, I don't believe that much in morphology.
Yes, I agree. I agree. We did so much on this years ago.
So yeah. The value being, I have done conventional IVF in patients with just 2% normal forms.
Yes. Yeah, it's very controversial. Some embryologists leave oocyte fixed in holding pipette for a few seconds till they inject till injected area retained to normal shape. Is it increase something?
No, I think I understand what you mean. They're just saying, do you just wait for the oocyte to regain shape to normality before releasing it? No, I think you'll be spending a lot of time. Just be very gentle at releasing the egg off the holding pipette, and then you're fine.
Which media to do ICSI? Culture media without HEPs or with HEPs?
I do it in hippies, but again, this is really a personal preference. If you do it in a media without hippies, you have to be very quick, very fast, less than 1 minute per egg.
Oh, ICSI by using frozen sperm. How long do you thaw and prepare sperm for ICSI? And are there the time of sperm recover?
2 hours before the ICSI, I would thaw the sperm. It takes us potentially an hour to prepare it and potentially 40-45 minutes in the incubator.
How do you deal with fragile sperm? ICSI, how is identified with what's normal?
Fragile sperm meaning it's either moving or it's not moving. So there's nothing in between.
Yeah.
Sometimes you could be seeing twitching sperm, but that's still motility.
Did you believe that several times immobilization and swipe of sperm can increase fertilization rate?
No, I've shown data today that has done comparisons that single, double, and triple swipes are not necessary. So you don't need multiple swipes.
And Emma, is it better for short tail or drag sperm to inject? What is better for short tail? I don't know. Don't worry.
I would prefer not to choose sperm with abnormalities. So try and look for other sperm.
Have you tried strontium chloride for oocytes? No. For the benefit of the audience, kindly tell us the name of the injection pipette companies where you reported higher degradation rates, and what are you currently using? I think that's too controversial. Another question about fragile sperm, but we've answered that one. Oh, one of the last three. Any comments on oocytes with severe PV debris? I think we've answered that as well. Your experience with embryo fragmentation on day 3. Do you transfer day 3 or wait till day 5?
We always do blastocyst culture in almost 98% of the cases. I'd rather tell a couple that they haven't made a blastocyst rather than do a day 3 transfer, but that's just our protocol.
The last question was actually a comment. Thank you, very useful. Thank you again for organizing. So just in the last few seconds now to finish off, I will do the second poll, which is just getting your feedback. So did you find this webinar useful, very useful, quite useful, okay, or not useful? So hopefully we'll get lots saying very useful. And while we're waiting for that, I'd really like to thank Alpesh. I think you've done an amazing job on these webinars. There's a lot of webinars out there now, but a lot of them are giving very sort of high tech and, you know, the sort of deep discussions, which I think is brilliant, and they have their place to keep our minds active. But I also think that we mustn't forget the basic level. So with our academy, we've always tried to give you the basics of these things. We're very aware that at conferences you can hear more advanced embryology, but what our passion's always been is to teach you the basics. And that's very much what Alpesh has been doing in the last 2 weeks and done an absolutely amazing job. So similar to last week, 86% said very useful, 11% said quite useful, and we had a couple of people who just thought it was okay. But I'd like to thank you all now for this webinar. Just to confirm, I will post the video tonight on the Embryology and PGD Academy YouTube channel. And within the next day or so, I will email you all the YouTube link and also the login details for next week. So next week, it's PGT, and a really important talk. From Roy, we are getting more complicated with the PGT diagnosis as we test more, we learn more, but then we have to try and interpret that. So I think it's going to be really important to hear from Roy, and Alpesh and I will also discuss some information about PGT. We're not going to concentrate on biopsy or anything. We'll just talk about the interpretation of the reports from the genetics lab. So we look forward to seeing you then. Please don't worry about emailing me. I will email you all with the login details for next week's meeting. Same time, same place. Thank you again so much, Alpesh. That really was so important. This basic information is not covered. We've got Mohammed with his hand up. I'll let you talk if you want to say anything. Oh, your mic's off at the moment. I'll mute you. Did you want to say anything? We've got a couple of hands up as well. Oh, no, they've gone down again.
Yeah, his mic is off now.
Yeah.
Hi.
Are you hearing me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We can hear.
Okay. I just want one question. What about to think about retrograde ejaculation? If the patient is in retrograde ejaculation, so what do you recommend? So we can go for ejaculation sample for ICSI, or we can go for PESA or any other option?
That was one of the questions, Mohammed, that was asked. So I would always prefer to use ejaculated sperm over testicular sperm as a first rule of thumb. So, but what I said was that there's a very strict protocol on how men with retrograde ejaculation should be primed with bicarbonate tablets beforehand, before they do their sample, because otherwise the sperm can face damage due to the acidity in the urine. And again, there's a very strict laboratory protocol in terms of how the sperm sample should be prepared to extract out of the urine.
Thank you, Alpesh. Thank you, Alpesh. And there was one person. Sorry, yeah.
One more question, if you have a time.
Yes, yeah, we'll be
okay.
quick.
Only simple question. What do you think about globosospermia? If the patient is globosospermia, so
okay.
So
with globosospermia, I would use calcium ionophore after the ICSI.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. So we are going to. Sorry, I'm just going to. Okay. Sorry, we had some interference there. So one person on the chat said they couldn't hear. They didn't have a good connection, but that's a local issue. I've got my kids all on their Xbox at the moment, and I live in a village, and I've still managed to get the connection. So people's connection will vary, but we do have this video going on YouTube tonight, so hopefully people can watch it back. So we've already had some very lovely comments and thank yous from people in the chat. So I'm going to close the meeting now, and we'll hopefully see you next week. And I will, as I said, email you in the next few days. And thanks again very much, Alpesh. So I'm going to stop the recording and then finish off. Thank you.